Thanks so much for the invitation from Jim B to highlight our work and for us to share with you a little bit about this project. My name is Laura Ott, and I am currently at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, but I am presenting this work with my colleagues, Linda Hodges and William LaCourse from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And this work is from a recent paper we published in Jim B titled Supporting Deaf Students in Undergraduate Research Experiences, Perspectives of American Sign Language Interpreters. So we wanted to first start off by providing a little background information about deaf students in undergraduate degree programs. So you may already be aware that students with disabilities are an underrepresented group within STEM disciplines. And we know that students who are deaf or hard of hearing are actually making up a growing percentage of enrollments in STEM undergraduate degree programs. So you'll notice from this chart here from a paper that we are seeing an increase in students enrolled that are deaf of hard of hearing students enrolling in STEM degree programs. And when we actually look at then the breakdown of those deaf and hard of hearing students in our STEM degree programs, you'll notice that about a third of them are actually intending to enroll in biology or life sciences degree programs. And so trying to develop strategies in which we can support deaf and hard of hearing students in these STEM degree programs really is important to, again, highlight the importance of diversity and diversifying our STEM workforce pipeline. So some of the high impact practices that we know are really beneficial for students in STEM degree programs include laboratory experiences, such as a course-based undergraduate research experience or working in a research lab with a mentor. And so this is just a quick table or chart, if you will, showing how all of these variables highlighting or measuring a sense of belonging in STEM are actually promoted by engaging in laboratory experiences. And it really helps them to develop key competencies such as reading primary literature, analyzing data, experimental design, so on and so forth. However, laboratory experiences also promote student persistence in STEM. We know that when students engage in some sort of authentic laboratory experience, again, whether that be mentored research or a classroom-based undergraduate research experience, they go on to persist in STEM careers, whether that is to stay in research or some other STEM-related career. And so again, this really highlights the importance of these undergraduate research experiences. However, we know that there are actually very few descriptions in the literature of how to engage deaf students in undergraduate research. We know that most of the time when deaf students are engaged in undergraduate research, they are in heterogeneous research teams that consist of both deaf and hearing students, and they oftentimes have mentors who may or may not have awareness of deaf culture. Similarly, most research experiences that engage deaf students do not include American Sign Language interpreters or other appropriate accommodations, and this can be for a variety of reasons. This could be due to costs associated with providing accommodations, irregular scheduling and when to have, say, sign language interpreters present, or lack of familiarity that interpreters may have with technical STEM fields. All of this to kind of lead that deaf students often communicate with their research teams via other modes of communication. And this can sometimes bring in then deaf students not feeling welcome in the research experience. And so we know that communication barriers can actually make deaf students feel unwelcome. And I want to highlight from this paper from Braun et al., published in CBE LSE in 2018, a few examples that really highlight the importance of ensuring effective communication for students who are deaf or hard of hearing in the research experience. So first, we have this first one here is, I find it very distracting to have an interpreter here. And again, this is something that would have been said by a hearing member of the research team. Again, this can make a deaf student feel unwelcome. Another example of a comment is, laws require us to provide accommodations, or tell me about the accommodations required during your training and tell me how much they will cost. Again, this can be really unwelcoming to a deaf student because they want to be there and they have a right to those accommodations. Again, getting at the cost of accommodations, in that a lot of times deaf students feel unwelcome because they feel as which accommodations are not provided due to the cost barrier. And then finally, hearing faculty and students may assume that American Sign Language is a lesser language than English and that this interferes with learning. And that's not the case. American Sign Language is actually a very appropriate and wonderful way for communication to be taken place between heterogeneous populations. And so all of this to get at our research project. And I'm actually going to hand it over to my colleague, Bill, who's going to explain to us a little bit about the project that this was part of.
Laura, thank you very much. So we were fortunate at UMBC to put in a proposal in the NIH for the STEM Build program, and that's building undergraduate infrastructure leading to diversity. And as with many of us, when we write proposals, we have great goals. We're going to have a comprehensive new model, but it was really focused on retaining diverse students in STEM. And our vision was not to just go after the scholars, but to go across the entire spectrum of students there, the learning spectrum. And so what we wanted to do is, can we build capacity, sustainability, scalability, so all students that come to our campuses have the opportunity to be successful in STEM. And in fact, we even had a motto, and Laura can put that up. Think 500, not 50, right? We have a lot of programs for a few people. How do we get to very large programs? Next slide. And so within there, when we think of diversity in a very broad context, how can public research institutions include deaf students in heterogeneous research groups consistent of deaf and hearing students? Well, that's the main question we were trying to answer as we went forward. Next slide. And so to do this, part of what we put forth is to do internship programs. And the internships involved a build group research, bringing students together from different institutions and having them work together on projects. And what we worked with was 5 community colleges and 2 four-year institutions. One was an HBCU, and the other one was Gallaudet. And what the students would do is they'd come together and work on research teams. And Laura can hit these as we go through. Student works in teams of 2 to 4. We wanted to make sure they had a real experience, not just a made-up problem. And so these teams are mentored by faculty members who volunteered to participate in these programs. The projects ran from somewhere in the vicinity of 6 to 8 weeks, but it's variable. But this actually fit into the size of our summer program, so there was a reason we did 6 to 8 weeks. One of the things that we had to learn, but more importantly, what the faculty had to learn, is that the scope of the projects had to fit the time duration that was available to them. And so keeping the students busy, they were there every day during each of the weeks that they were there. We also included a lot of enrichment activities and for professional development. And so all this came together and included in this process, we found we had over a number of years deaf students and hard of hearing students. Thank you, Laura. And this will take you on to some of the methodology, and I'm going to turn this over to Linda Hodges.
Hi, everybody. So As part of this project, American Sign Language interpreters were assigned to the two groups, research teams that had included both deaf and hearing enabled students for the whole summer, all the time, both in the research labs and in any kind of auxiliary meetings, which is often a different kind of model than is routinely used. And these ASL interpreters may or may not have had much experience with scientific research. And so we were interested in finding out a little bit more about their experience. And to do that, we felt a qualitative sort of study was more appropriate. So we conducted a single interview with all four interpreters at the same time at the conclusion of the 6-week internship. And we asked them 3 questions that became our research questions, which are on the next slide. We wanted to know how they viewed their role in providing support to the research team. How did the use of American Sign Language hinder or enable communication on the research teams? And then what challenges did they face when they were interpreting in a research environment? Next slide. So to conduct this research, the qualitative research, we recorded the interview and we had it transcribed by a professional service, speech bad in this case. And we used what's called a grounded theory approach, which means that 2 of us, Laura and I, went through the transcripts multiple times to look and see what kind of themes emerged. We did not look at the transcripts with themes in mind. We were not looking to see if the transcripts exemplified, if the interpreters said particular things. We looked to see what bubbled up from them, because we wanted to get their perspectives without imposing our preconceived notions on top of that. Then Laura and I went through the transcripts independently, as I said, multiple times. And the first time we're going through, we're looking to see, are there themes bubbling up? We did this independently, and then she and I got together and compared notes and came to consensus about the themes we were seeing. And then we went back to the transcripts and went through them, doing what's called coding, looking at which comments from which interpreters seem to actually exemplify the themes that we had seen bubbling up. And then we quantified that a bit to see which ones were most prominent. And if we had any differences in the coding, and there's always differences in coding, Laura and I matched about 75 to 80% of the time. But then we would resolve differences through a conversation, through consensus. And this is considered accepted and good practice in the field. And so we came up with 3 major themes. There were multiple themes, but 3 that really seemed to pop most of the time. And you can see these on the next slide. They centered on sort of the decisions that the interpreters had to make when they were working in this environment, the role that they assumed, when they interpreted, and how they chose to interpret. And so to show you a little bit about how we identified those codes when you're looking at people's conversation, we've captured some of those comments on the slides, and we're not going to read those to you. They're in the paper, but we are going to sort of highlight the key ideas in some of those. And so I'm going to share a little about the first theme, and then I'll turn it back over to Laura. So this first theme, deciding on what role that they as an interpreter took, because they're with these teams all the time. And we found a couple of key ideas popping out around that theme. One is that they viewed their role, their clients were both the hearing enabled and the deaf students. They were there if the hearing student wanted to say something to the deaf student, or the deaf student wanted to say something to the hearing student, and so on. So they had viewed their roles both ways. And then secondly, next slide, they considered themselves advocates for the deaf individual, and that they played a role in educating the hearing members of the team. So for example, if people were talking too fast, they're talking over one another, they would often moderate the conversation. Now, this could be a little tricky for them because they also wanted their deaf student to feel enabled and empowered to take that role of moderation themselves. But they were there if they needed to step in. And I'm going to turn it over back to Laura then to talk through the other themes and implications.
Thanks, Linda. So the next major theme that we found from reviewing the transcripts was that the ASL interpreters had to decide when to interpret, because they found that the research environment, particularly a lab, so all of these research teams were in what we would think of as a common molecular biology enabled lab. The lab itself can be challenging for visual communication. A great example of this is when, say, someone was demonstrating a technique that is fully visual, in which the deaf individual, it was more effective for them to watch the individual doing the technique than for the interpreter to be interpreting during that time, because it could actually take away from that visual communication. So being able to determine it's more important for this deaf individual to watch what's going on versus visually communicate via ASL was something that they had to decide. And they mentioned that this really took a lot of trust and the importance of the relationship that was built between the interpreters and the deaf student. Similarly, when they were looking at something, say, on a computer screen, oftentimes, if you happen to be hearing enabled, you may be looking at something on a computer screen and also listening to something at the same time. Whereas for a deaf individual, it's always a choice, given that their communication is visual, of where to look. And so watching something on a computer screen may or may not be conducive for being able to then communicate via American Sign Language, because the deaf individual has to choose where to look. This final one, which is very intuitive to me, but I think was really important that the ASL interpreters brought up, is that sometimes we go into a research environment that is just simply not conducive for visual communication, such as in a dark room, if you were to have to expose film, for example. Well, if you were to be communicating with a deaf individual, you would want to say everything out front before that individual went into the dark room, and then not talk once they were in there. The other thing that the ASL interpreters brought up was that some of these spaces can be very tight from an actual physical space. So you essentially have at least one additional person there. And again, that could also perhaps be an impediment to getting the actual task done. Now, another thing that the interpreters brought up in this theme of deciding when to interpret was deciding when to insert themselves into communication between the deaf and hearing individuals. A great example of this was one of the interpreters shared that when the deaf student had their nose in their lab work and was doing their actual research, such as measuring something out or micropipetting, if the ASL interpreter were to, say, wave their hands in their face to try to get their attention to be able to communicate something to them, that could actually be distracting for what the task is at hand. However, there may be important, say, ambient conversations going on that you wouldn't want the deaf student to miss out on. And so you have to choose, is it worth, say, interrupting the student doing their work, or do I need to hold on to that information and perhaps communicate to them after the fact, which obviously has its pros and cons depending on the particular situation. The final thing in theme 2 of deciding when to interpret was the importance of the relationship building within the research team and the ASL interpreters not wanting to alter that. And so they found that sometimes the deaf student and the hearing enabled students or team members would try to actually communicate directly. Some of the things that I saw with the students, for example, were things like using a whiteboard and writing some things out via a whiteboard, or if appropriate, sending text messages to each other. And so the ASL interpreters were very mindful of making sure that if there was that that relationship building aspect of communication taking place, to really let that happen. And obviously, if they are wanted or needed, someone on the team would let them know. The final theme that emerged was deciding how to interpret. And one thing that the ASL interpreters highlighted was the importance of advanced preparation and familiarity with the scientific vocabulary, because they often found that there weren't established signs for the vocabulary that was used in the research environment. And so it was really important that the interpreters had access to the research articles that the students were reading. And they oftentimes Googled terms to make sure that they were interpreting them in the right context, or say the right way. And they found that the more that they were centralized within that research environment and exposed to the different vocabulary used, it not only made them more comfortable being there, but it also really helped with the interpretation. Similarly, they had to determine optimal translations because, as I said previously, there are oftentimes not established signs for technical words. So they would have to oftentimes come up with signs on their own, and this was often mimicking the motion of whatever that activity was, whether it was using a micropipette or maybe looking at a microscope, because otherwise you would spell that out, which wasn't either efficient or sometimes it wasn't too meaningful. And so they oftentimes had to think about how best to sign different things or different terms, if you will, that didn't have those established signs. And they also liked having the relationships with the research experts to, again, ensure that they were using these terms that they didn't have established signs for in the correct context. The final thing that they brought up was consistency in interpreter assignments, because this was really important for addressing the challenge of specific and accurate vocabulary. Now, this quote I am going to read a little bit from because I think it provides a really nice context. One of the labs or one of the research teams was working with an invertebrate organism in which they had to sacrifice the organisms, but there aren't established signs for sacrifice. And so instead they sign die or kill, but what should be voiced for communication with the hearing individual would be sacrifice. And so what they said was that if you happen to be a substitute, you wouldn't maybe necessarily know that. And so you would say, oh, you kill or the invertebrate organism dies. But in reality, you should say sacrifice as the appropriate terminology. And it could make it as if either the deaf person messed up in their communication, or it could just come off odd. And so consistency on those assignments were really helpful in that research setting when there's so much vocabulary and consistency in the way that those words or the vocabulary is used. So those were our three themes. And from those three themes, here were the overarching conclusions that we made from this work. First is that the American Sign Language interpreters who were assigned to support these heterogeneous research teams served both the deaf and hearing individuals and were there to promote communication on those heterogeneous research teams. They also supported the integration of deaf students into those heterogeneous research teams and oftentimes advocated for them to help the hearing-abled individuals to understand more about the deaf culture and help advocate for the needs of the deaf student. And having consistency in the assignments allowed the interpreters to be more familiar and comfortable with STEM-specific language. And all of this is that inclusion of sign language interpreters has the potential to promote the sense of belonging of deaf students in an undergraduate research experience because of these themes identified. And if you'll recall back towards the beginning of this webinar, we talked about some of those barriers that a lot of deaf students have felt in regards to interpretation and accommodation. And again, providing this consistency with ASL interpreters or just sign language interpreters in general, because there's a variety of different sign language types, having that there is a way that we could actually promote the inclusion and sense of belonging of our deaf students in undergraduate research. So what are the implications of this work for teaching? The first is that instructors should build relationships with interpreters and provide advanced access to materials to allow the interpreters to prepare. Now, I had the pleasure of working with the students in this internship, and I can actually attest to this firsthand. Building that relationship with the interpreters and making sure that they had access to those materials, I know helped for more effective communication in the research environment. And they felt comfortable coming to me asking for clarity on those STEM specific terms, which I think is, it was nice to build that relationship with them. Be mindful of your physical space and how it can impact communication. Oftentimes in a research lab, we have a dark room or we have very confined spaces. And if you have a deaf or hard of hearing student who has a sign language interpreter, that's one additional individual that would need to be in that environment to be able to have effective communication. And so being aware of that is really important, especially as you think about where you position things or where you set up, say, demonstrations. Promote and foster equitable communication strategies within student groups. So developing techniques to help groups develop those effective communication strategies. Whether it, having assigned communicators that assignments rotate frequently, or allowing students some group processing on specific how is communication going within our group, giving them those opportunities to have equitable communication is really important. And there are certainly various different published strategies that you could use to help with this. Finally, consider adapting universal design for learning principles for your teaching. So you'll notice, for example, in this PowerPoint, we highlighted words in blue instead of red, and that is actually to help with individuals who may have a visual impairment because everyone can see blue, for example, but some individuals have a hard time seeing the color red. Alternatively, you'll notice that our PowerPoint presentation is captioned, and there's a really easy way to do this in PowerPoint so that all of your students, regardless of whether they are deaf or hard of hearing or hearing able, can benefit from also viewing the captions. And so I have a screenshot here showing you how to do this. This would be under the slideshow tab of your PowerPoint. And if you click the always use subtitles, and then if you go in the subtitle settings, you can actually select where you would like the location of those subtitles in response to where your slides are when you present. I personally choose below, but you can do whatever makes the most sense for you. So with that, we would like to thank Michael Canali, who is our partner from UMBC Student Disability Services, who made the American Sign Language interpreter assignments, as well as our interpreters for being willing to share their experiences with us. And again, to the Journal of Microbiology and Biology Education for inviting us to be here as part of this webinar. And then finally, we want to acknowledge the National Institutes of Health, specifically the National Institute of General Medical Sciences, for their support of the STEM Build at UMBC initiative. And before we go to questions, here is our contact information. We would be happy to answer any questions that you all have about this work or about our methods, etc. So thank you very much. And at this point, we will gladly take any questions.
We have a question from Peter. And he says, first, this is a very important paper, so kudos. I have some questions about the interpreters. What were the interpreters' credentials? Did the deaf students select their own interpreters? And were the students satisfied with the interpreting services? And you can take piecemeal and I can repeat as needed.
Sure. So Peter, that's a really great question. So the answer was that the interpreters were assigned through our University Student Disability Services office. When we learned that we had 2 deaf students that summer joining us, we reached out to the Student Disability Services office, shared with them some of those important details, and they actually made the assignments. And as for the credentials, I'm honestly not actually entirely sure what the credentials were, outside of the fact that they were all fabulous people to work with. But when it came to selection, the deaf students did not actually select their own interpreters. Well, let me walk that back. They did kind of a little bit. So this particular summer, there were 2 deaf students, and how it was structured in that there were 4 interpreters assigned total, 2 for each deaf student, because they would rotate on and off 20-minute intervals. Now, they initially kind of separated 2 in one and 2 in the other, but I think they also did a little bit of mixing in as they went into the semester, just based off of interest, interpreting styles, etc. I think overall, the students were really satisfied with the interpreting services. I think it really speaks to the professionalism of our interpreters, of they really are there to serve all individuals, and provided such a great benefit. And it was a really wonderful way for that communication to occur in that heterogeneous team.
So we welcome all questions, especially if you're new to these types of studies. We understand that a lot of the ASM audience are bench or field researchers and may be new to articles in Journal of Microbiology and Biology Education, especially those that involve human subjects research, such as this study. So any questions are welcome, especially those from newbies. While people are thinking about it, would any of you like to talk about how you got started in this research and how you transitioned from maybe research that you did at the bench or in the field or in the lab?
I spent much of my teaching career. I'm now the director Faculty Development Center at UMBC, and so I transitioned into faculty development about 20 years ago. But before that, I was a tenured faculty member and spent most of my career in liberal arts colleges. So I did undergraduate research with my students, but I also spent a lot of time teaching. And we all know it can be very puzzling, sometimes frustrating, but certainly intellectually puzzling about why students find some of what we do so difficult to learn. It doesn't seem that difficult to us, so why is it difficult to them? And so I found that I really got interested in what students were thinking, how they were approaching their learning, and so on. So I had some opportunities to get involved with some other folks who were doing pedagogical research or the scholarship of teaching and learning. And in addition to continuing to do some bench research with my undergraduates, I started trying to dip my hand into measuring, say, differences in the way students studied when I would try, say, active learning interventions. Some of the early work I did was naive in retrospect, but that's okay. We always learn something by studying our teaching and our students' learning. So, for example, I gave them a pre-post survey on approaches to study, one at the beginning of the course and then one at the end after we went through sort of some intervals of problem-based learning. So a lot of times the questions you have and maybe the frustrations you have about your students' learning can be ripe fodder for dipping your toe in. And you can go to journal articles for background, but there's usually somebody on your campus, a teaching center or just other faculty who are doing this, who are valuable resources. And I've found it's really fun collaborating on this work, this kind of work. It was a great experience working with Laura and Bill on this project.
Thank you. So you got started through networking with colleagues at your campus.
The only thing I would add to that was, I'm sure many of us in this room maybe are trained as more quantitative researchers, so numbers. I know I certainly am, but I have actually found that the qualitative piece really helps to then inform my quantitative work later on. So sometimes just simply sitting down and having a conversation similar to what we did here with obviously very specific questions in mind can really actually help open up doors and make you think about what it is you're trying to understand on a deeper level. And so I know, at least for myself, I, for the longest time, was a little weary of qualitative work because I was always such a numbers person. But I've actually come to really love this qualitative work because it can be so insightful. And the information that you can glean from this is very different, but equally of value than the quantitative work. And so I encourage people to maybe step outside of their comfort zone a little bit and engage in some of these types of projects that are very maybe different than how we are inherently trained.
And that's a good segue for me because everything here is out of my comfort zone. I'm still a practicing analytical chemist, and here we are talking about biology topics in what we're doing here. And I made to get to be an analytical chemist and then to chair and dean, I made all the mistakes. First generation, not much money, transfer student to your institution along the way. And so my big drive was, as I was able to get to, was to find opportunities for all students to be successful in STEM, whatever they may be. And I was able to have the good fortune to have the opportunity to write a proposal that allowed us to try to come to that point. And I'm going to say openly that it would not be possible to do this great work without people like Laura Ott and Linda Hodges, because they give all the support and they make all this happen for me. And I get the great pleasure of sitting back and watching great work be done. So my goal here is to help all students from a diverse background at every letter. If we let them into a university, we have an ethical and moral responsibility to have them be successful or successful as possible with the best teaching methods out there. And that's what studies like this are all about, is finding the best way for each student to learn. So I deeply appreciate this opportunity, Rachel, to speak.
You're very welcome. Oh, it makes my heart so full. I love hearing everybody say that helping all students learn and be successful is key to their career. That's so, yay. Okay, we have a couple of questions. Thank you for sharing your stories, everybody. That's really helpful, especially to all of our audience members that are new to this research. Carlos has a question. Do you have any recommendations for working with interpreters in a virtual environment? Do you still use captions?
First of all, hi, Carlos. Carlos is a good friend of mine from many years ago. Still a good friend of mine. I actually think this virtual environment is very conducive to diverse communication, partly because of the trick I shared with showing the subtitles. I've had a lot of conversations with, say, diverse or disability student office coordinators, et cetera, and they talk about how these accommodations that we specifically think of for a certain population is actually of value for all students. And so I've actually started in all of my teaching and recording, especially during this COVID semester we're just wrapping up right now, of leaving the subtitles on because it benefits all students. Now, whether interpreters would still be needed is actually a really great question. And it would be something that I would actually want to then lean on the professionals in my institutional disability services office to have a conversation about. I know that they oftentimes interact with students via these virtual platforms. And so they may decide, depending on the specific construct or setup of your course, that perhaps captions in other virtual modes may be more appropriate for effective communication than including an interpreter. So that's actually a really great question.
Doug asks, thanks for the presentation, kudos. And I appreciated the lost in interpretation example, such as sacrifice the mice versus killing the mice. I've worked with several deaf and hard of hearing students and found that interpreters have indeed helped my students in the lab. My question is whether or not my university is legally required to cover interpreter services or if that should come from my modest size NSF grant.
Wow, that's also a really great and important question. It's my understanding from having a conversation with my institutional disability services office in that we as an institution will provide interpreters. That said, I don't personally know the legal aspects of it and what laws are specifically in place. I know that because of the Disability Act that we do need to provide appropriate accommodations, but that doesn't necessarily always mean providing interpreters, for example. There may be alternative approaches. That said, we found that interpreters were the appropriate way to go here. Again, we perhaps could have used alternative means, such as what we highlighted, like texting, like programs or apps or writing on whiteboards. We found that this was the most appropriate, and we were fortunate to have the funds to then be able to cover those costs.
Yeah, I mean, in one way, studies like this are rather important, right, to make the case to your administration that maybe even though you can meet the letter of the law with a lesser accommodation, that given the commitment of the institution to diversity, do we want to just meet the minimum, or do we want to do what seems to work best in terms of fostering student belonging? I mean, ours isn't the be-all, end-all definitive study, but it certainly helps support that idea that the students are more integrated into the experience, and part of that when they have that full interpreter. I'm just speaking off the top here, but federal grants come with overhead, indirects, many of them, not all. And you can make a case using the research to tap into some of those indirect funds that may be being used elsewhere for additional kinds of support with the interpreters. I don't know, Bill might know if that's not a possible thing to do, but sometimes I know indirects are used for that kind of additional support.
Well, it depends who's actually in charge of divvying up the indirects, and they usually have formulaic by campus. But I think you're right, Linda, you're right on. This is an opportunity for making an argument of how you can help those students that are either part of your campus or visiting your campus. Just think of opportunity. Every summer we have hundreds of students, maybe even thousands, filling out opportunities for internships and REUs at other universities, and they have all these opportunities for experiences. But if you're deaf or hard of hearing, your opportunities are so narrow, they get narrowed down. And so a public university or any educational institution that has the ability, and that's what we're showing here, is that you can have very successful experiences for deaf students in a heterogeneous group at your campus. This is what this, for me, is showing. And then finding the funding is something that in some ways is, we have to find a way to do it as we go forward. The one thing that Laura might want to speak to a little bit is the outcome, like at the symposium, how the students performed at the end. This is the mechanics of it. This is how you do it. It's good, but tell them a little bit about the outcome. I think someone might want to hear that.
Sure. I guess real quick before I talk about the outcome, just to reiterate, I think it's really important to develop a relationship with your institutional disability services office, because they really are a wealth of resources for how to approach diverse students in your classroom, in your research labs, et cetera. And so, if you don't already, definitely try to identify a contact, and they're great at helping individuals think through what are the best strategies here for this particular context. So regarding the outcome, at the end of this 6 to 8 week internship, students gave an oral presentation in a symposium where the teams gave about a 25-minute seminar. And this included our students who were deaf signing their research results and it being communicated via the ASL interpreters. And it was really wonderful to see the deaf students be included and being a part of this dissemination of their hard work after 6 or 8 weeks. I mean, these students put in an incredible amount of work, and being able to disseminate it in this way that we think of, classically as this oral type of format. And so again, it just really highlights the importance of finding ways to provide these equitable communication strategies for your students. Similarly, they also gave poster presentations in a symposium. Again, they had help with they communicated via their ASL interpreters.
William and Laura, this is Doug, and thanks for sharing your thoughts. I kind of wish I had you on my campus for support. So my institution has had 3 different directors of Office of Accessibility, and some have been supportive. Unfortunately, the current leader of this office hasn't shared my excitement. It's the only positive way I can spin this. In contrast, the students in my lab, both hearing and non-hearing, have been fantastic, and it's really kept me going. But at times I felt like I've been working on my own and a bit of an island, and trying to, learn how best to accommodate these students, make sure that they're successful in the lab. And so I actually have built into my NSF grants resources for interpreters. However, I just can't afford to have them in the lab 40 hours a week for 8 weeks. So oftentimes, I'll mandate that the interpreters are present for lab meetings, for when the students share their research. But I wish I had a mechanism to have the interpreters around more often. And unfortunately, my university hasn't helped cover the expenses.
That's a really difficult situation to be in, and I'm I commend you for what you're trying to do to promote the success of these students in your lab and welcoming them into your lab. Have you talked to the students about perhaps alternative strategies that may be of value to them? I'm trying to think outside of the box a little bit to maybe offer some suggestions.
Yeah. So prior to their arrival onto campus, I asked them if they would like an interpreter, if they're comfortable only having an interpreter for just a few hours each week. And fortunately, most of the students have felt comfortable with that. I mean, other attempts would be my humbling attempt to learn ASL. That's been nice, although I really cannot clearly communicate an experiment or the methodology. Just more for pleasantry, right? How are you? Do you have sisters, brothers, things like that? And other attempts have been, to use 2 keyboards attached to a computer. So that's been helpful.
Yeah. The only other thing I would suggest, and perhaps we can talk offline about this, I know that there are some virtual platforms that are available to help with communication between hearing abled and then deaf and hard of hearing. And so perhaps they might be another strategy you can go with. So maybe you and I can connect and we can certainly have some conversations about that.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that. Thanks.
I know in one of the labs that summer, the students all joined in GroupMe. So those kinds of social media, I guess, outlets may be helpful for generating a sense of connection and easy communication too.
I don't see any new questions coming in. So I'm going to thank all of my speakers. This has been a great discussion and sorely needed. We can tell that a lot of you that are attending have similar issues that you are working with your students and want to find the best solutions that work for them. So I commend all of you for thinking about this and putting your students' needs first. A couple of administrative things I put into the chat box where you can find a link to all the recordings from today's event. It'll be available probably about an hour or two. And the previous 2 GIMBY Lives that we did in October and November. Those presentations will all be available through the end of 2020. So do take time to watch them before the end of the calendar year. And we do intend to host these again all once per month in the year 2021. So if you're on the MicroEDU listserv, pay attention for a registration link. And we'll probably put out bulk emails to the ASM journals as well. So Laura put her email address into the chat box. And if you ever need help with anything else related to education, through ASM, you can contact me through education@asmusa.org. Great. Thank you so much for attending today. Take care, everybody.